Thank you everybody for joining us. If we haven't met, my name's James Kirkup. I'm the director of the Social Market Foundation. You are, I hope you realize, here dialed into one of our Ask the Expert talks. Now, Ask the Expert is a series of events that we do in conjunction with our friends at UK Research and Innovation, who are the parent body of the ESRC, the big funding organization for social science research. And the whole point of these talks is for us at the SMF to discharge our charitable mission to improve policy making and understanding of public policy by bringing the publicly funded expertise of people like our primary speaker Barbara here to what used to be Westminster. Obviously it's now my spare room, but figurative Westminster, which we think can benefit greatly from the insights and understanding of our academic friends. So thank you all for coming. In terms of running order, what you will hear first is we're first of all going to have a presentation from Professor Barbara Petrongolo of your Oxford and the LSE, or
yes.
Yes, who's a double-hatted professor, who is going to talk about her research on the impact of this pandemic on gender roles, employment, and household life. After we've heard from Barbara, and she'll be talking us through her slides, I'm going to have a quick chat with our panelists, Matthew Percival from the CBI, who can talk to us about the employer dimension of this, and our final panelist, Nicky Morgan, who Nicky used to be lots of things. Nicky has been many things, and I'm sure will be many more. Former cabinet minister, former chair of the Treasury Select, most pertinently in my case, a trustee of the SMF, and therefore one of my bosses. And so everything she says is going to be brilliant, and I'm going to nod sagely at every point. And then after we've heard from all of our panelists, I will go to you attendees. There are currently 89 of you, I think, according to my screen here. When you would like to ask a question, if you can use the chat box to ask your question, I'll keep an eye on that. I'll then figuratively point to people as they ask questions, and my SMF colleagues will make you visible so you can actually you can ask your question in person if you'd like. It may be towards the end of the session I start summarizing bulk questions if we're getting short of time, but primarily we'll try and put you on camera so you can actually ask your question to all of the participants yourself. So without further ado, I promise I'll try and keep this promise that this will be the longest bit of talking you will hear from me for the rest of the session, because I'm always the least interesting person at these sessions, so by some way. So I'm going to shut up now and hand over to Barbara, who will share her screen with you and talk you through her research. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for inviting me at this event. It's really a pleasure to talk about this recent work about COVID and gender inequalities. Can you see my screen? Is that all right? Great. So this is based on recent work with my co-author Claudia Hucka, who is in Madrid, and as James said, I am in Oxford, and then I have a research affiliation at the LSE. So this work is based on the observation that while COVID is a crisis that is hitting most economies as hard as the deepest recessions, the nature of the crisis itself is kind of exceptional, because the kind of sectors and jobs that have been hit is quite different from those of previous recessions. So in most previous recessions, the sectors that were most heavily hit were basically like manufacturing, construction, so male-intensive sectors. And by contrast, the lockdown measures have naturally hit sectors that are like service sectors, sectors with frequent interactions between customers or between providers and consumers. So for example, we're talking about retail, hotels, restaurants, and leisure. And these sectors are indeed female intensive. Now, among workers that are not directly subject to lockdown, then there is a very important dimension that we need to look at to understand, for example, job and earning losses, and this is about the ability or lack thereof of working from home. So this is a very important marker of earning losses. And then finally, one very important thing that happened during the first lockdown was that all schools and childcare centers were closed. So all the education and childcare services were taken in-house and were added to sort of pre-existing needs of domestic work. Now, from this kind of introduction, you can immediately see why gender might be an important dimension of what's going on. So this kind of state of things does matter for gender inequality because women are all represented in services, for example, in retail and hospitality sectors. But in a sense of setting this, partly of setting this, women are also represented in sectors that have been deemed sort of critical to challenging the impacts of the pandemic, like health and social care. And also women seem to be overrepresented in occupations that can be performed from the home. Another very important point about the baseline allocation of work is that women are also more heavily engaged in childcare and domestic work in general. So just to give you an idea, before the crisis, if we just look at families with young children in the UK, dependent children, not necessarily very young children, mothers were doing on average 16 hours of childcare per week against about half of this amount done by fathers. So this is the baseline allocation. Now, what is the available evidence? Now, since the onset of this crisis about 7 months ago, we have seen quite a lot of evidence because people really tried to make the best possible use of whatever little evidence was coming along. So there's at least like 3 types of evidence that researchers have been using. One is very early in this pandemic, we had very little real-time data. So the only thing we could do, we could basically look at the baseline allocation of men and women across, for example, different tasks in the household, different sectors in the labor market. And then based on this kind of baseline allocation, one could make projection about impacts of the crisis on the employment patterns of men and women. And then quite early during the crisis, there have been a lot of real-time ad hoc surveys. So basically surveys conducted independently of each other on various sort of samples selected online, surveys done online. And this, of course, were an extremely rich source of information about what was going on in the employment and work patterns of men and women, with a possible disadvantage that those surveys typically had relatively small sample size, and we didn't know as much about how representative they were about the average population. And then further ahead, little by little, we also started to see waves, new waves of regular, big and representative surveys, for example, like Understanding Society, which introduced a special COVID supplement over the summer. So this is what we're going to do in this piece of work. We're going to focus on this kind of relatively large sample with representative information for the UK. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just pure labor market outcomes. What's happening in the labor market to the hours, earnings, job loss incidence of men and women. So this table here is comparing outcomes between January and May 2020. So if you just look at the first column, this tells you about job loss. So the probability of losing one's job is very similar for men and women, 4.4 for men, 4.1 for women. So not only is very similar, but also very small. Because in the UK, we know that most of the adjustment in hours worked happened through furlough, through the job retention scheme, which was introduced in March. So by May, almost 1/3 of men and 27% of women had been furloughed, so quite high proportions. And this was just in May, then of course it kept going on. Men lost about 12.5 hours per week. Women lost about 10 hours per week on average in terms of working hours. And the earnings of men went down on average by £50 per week, and the earnings of women went down on average by £23 per week. So if anything, the situation looks a little bit more optimistic for women. It says that women experience slightly smaller losses on the labor market, but these differences are almost completely explained by the different job allocation of men and women. So for example, if we control for the fact that women were overrepresented in critical industries like health, or they were more likely to be able to work from home, we can see that men and women are hit almost exactly in terms of labor market outcomes. Now, if anything, more recently, HMRC released more recent data about furlough. And for example, for July 2020, this is the first time we see that the incidence of furlough is slightly higher among women than among men. But again, we're talking about small differences. Okay. Now, looking inside the household, what happens to time used inside the household? And here the most important marker, I would say, is time devoted to childcare. Why is that? Because this is the component of home production that basically exploded during the crisis due to the closure of nurseries and schools. And this is because research has shown that the presence of children is the biggest factor, is the factor that explains the biggest share of the gender pay gap among men, between men and women. So the presence of children seems to be really the source of the gender pay gap. And this is possibly where it comes from, because women are much more involved in childcare, and this also may affect their labor market choices. So on this diagram here, what I represent is the childcare hours of men and women before the crisis on the left, and this is after the crisis. Before the crisis, as I was saying before, men were doing about 8 hours and women were doing about half of that. So in total, at the family level, we're talking about 25 hours of childcare. After the crisis, this has literally exploded to 43 hours. Okay, now this higher load of childcare, where did it fall upon? Well, women, both men and women, of course, were doing a lot more childcare because all the childcare was taken in-house, but women took up a higher share. So basically the gender differential in childcare increased from 9 hours per week to 13 hours per week. So the gender differential expanded. Now this is on average. So basically we are comparing the average family before the lockdown with the average family during the lockdown. What I think is kind of interesting is also looking at the distribution of these changes in childcare across different households. So one way to look at it is to think, okay, who is mostly in charge of childcare in a given household? If you think about the person mostly in charge of childcare, you can think that that person is probably more constrained in his or her labor market choices. So this may have the strongest impact in the sort of labor market involvement. So before the crisis, UK families basically just belong to one of these two groups. Either the mother is mostly in charge, 29%, of childcare is sort of shared more or less equally between the mother and the father, 48%. And then there are two very tiny categories. Father mostly in charge is 2.7%, and this is other people mostly in charge, okay? So there was a very tiny minority of UK households that before the crisis had the father mostly in charge of childcare. What happens after the crisis? I mean, the share of households where the mother is mostly in charge increases, unsurprisingly, from 49% to 56%. But what is more striking is that there is a huge increase in the share of households where the father is now in charge of childcare. And this is possibly because maybe the father is working from home or the father was furloughed and his spouse was a woman who might have been working in a critical sector, so she might have been working very long hours, so she could do very little childcare. Okay, so one can really argue that this movement from 2.7 to 18% is really a key change in the distribution of childcare, despite the fact that women were still taking the higher proportion. So an interesting question for the long-term term is to understand whether there might be any legacy of this kind of dramatic changes that were sort of temporary. Some are temporary, some we don't know how long they would last, but there have been radical changes to the organization of work and family life. So the question is whether we could expect any long-lasting consequence happening, for example, via learning. One learns about a different way to organize their work that might be useful for the longer run. Habit formation, you get used to working from home, you might not be willing to go back to the office Monday to Friday come the recovery, or via the evolution of social norms and gender norms. So we have seen an explosion in the incidence of working from home. So will that affect the incidence of smart working at the end of any lockdown? And then the key question is, will that have an impact on productivity one way or another? And there are reasons to think about productivity in smart working changing up or down. I mean, one can think of different stories. And what kind of impact does it have on the work-life balance and the gender gap? Then we have seen the reversal of traditional gender roles in a sizable share of UK households. So in which I just said the father became the primary provider of childcare. And this is interesting because we know that the allocation of childcare in many contexts mostly reflect underlying gender norms. And gender norms are very slowly evolving, but little by little they do evolve over time. For example, they respond to forced changes in working society. So one typical sort of massive and forced change was the male mobilization rate during World War II, when a share of men were drafted into the army, and the jobs that were left vacant by those men had to be taken by women. So women entered the labor force, and they were entering sectors that were typically male-dominated, like heavy manufacturing, military industry. So the next generation was exposed to working women and basically had their norms shaped by those kind of early labor market entrants, and this may have had an impact for the medium run. Another change, for example, is the introduction of father quotas in parental leave. So the question is, should we expect lockdowns to ease the breakdown of traditional gender roles? And this is, of course, a question up for research. Now, something that is kind of interesting these days is that we are getting into a second lockdown, unfortunately. And the main difference with the first lockdown is not in the type of sectors that are hit by the lockdown, but the fact that schools are not closed. So there's not going to be the childcare component. So let's see what the childcare allocation will be over the coming months, whether there has been some permanent changes coming from the childcare allocation during the first lockdown. Okay, I will stop here and thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I mean, there's lots and lots of questions I think everyone will have to ask. I've got half a dozen, but I'll try not to ask them because other people should. So, but what I'd first of all like to do is go to our next panelist. Thank you, Matthew. Now, Matthew Percival is the Director of People and Skills at the CBI, so the country's biggest business organisation. And Matthew, I'm really interested in your thoughts, and therefore, I suppose, the business perspective on some of the issues that Barbara has just described there. I suppose a starting question would be, in the last few years, and we've seen a lot of people in business talking about and often acting on the need to address gender imbalances in the workplace, and yet we've seen a different experience by gender in the workplace of responses to COVID. So can you just talk a little bit about how that commitment to diversity and inclusion has interacted with some of the immediate business imperatives put on companies by by the current circumstances?
Of course, I'm happy to be here this morning, James. Thank you for the invitation. I think one of the things that we were looking out for going into this crisis was thinking back on the aftermath of the financial crisis, inclusion did slip down the agenda. And was the same going to be true this time around or not? And I guess there were some factors suggesting that maybe we should expect it shouldn't have done, in that this wasn't a financial crisis, it was a very human crisis. And there have been aspects of it that, well, it was just described at our annual conference that's been taking place over the last 3 days. One of our members says the genie's out of the bottle, and there has been a great humanising of workplaces, the children running into the back of the webinar. I haven't seen it happen to anybody just yet, but the interruptions. I've got a neighbour who at the moment is doing some DIY, and if you hear some banging in the background, that's why we're all getting used to these sorts of disruptions to family life, and it's not a source of embarrassment to working life anymore. So there are some factors that were perhaps pushing in favour of optimism that we wouldn't see inclusion slipping down the corporate agenda through this crisis. I don't think you can separate in the broader concept of inclusion either the extent to which businesses have responded to the reactions from their staff, also to the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, to the broader agenda of inclusion that has also kept it high on the agenda. We're here to talk about research, so I'll give you some of our numbers as well. Most of this is published, but not absolutely all of it just yet. I'm going to talk about two different data sources. We do an annual survey of our members on employment trends each year. We deliberately did the media for that weeks after we collected the data, knowing that forecasts for whether jobs were going to be created or lost was going to be a rapidly moving event this year, and delaying until December to publish data from August was very much a hostage to fortune. So most of that's out already. And the other data source you can also find on our website is some surveying we did about what's going to change through COVID that we did with Ipsos Mori, called No Turning Back, that's now on our website and was published earlier this week. Both of those sources suggest that inclusion is not something that's suffered and slipped down the agenda through this crisis, which is something we're obviously hugely positive about, because the CBI's run a campaign around the importance of inclusive workplaces, not only as a social issue, but as an economic issue. So hugely positive to see that's not slipping back. The data from those two sources is our employment trends survey, which was the data collected over the summer this year, said 2/3 of businesses saying their focus has been maintained on inclusion, and 1/3 of businesses saying that it's been increased. And interestingly, that data set gave us a feeling for how maybe the focus was shifting. Different aspects of inclusion became most important to them through this crisis. They're the two aspects of inclusion that we saw businesses pivoting a greater share of their efforts towards were both race and mental health. And I guess I can see that also thinking about CBI as an employer. If you had our HR director rather than me here today, she'd say, we paused our efforts to analyse our gender pay gap as quickly as we'd normally have done this year on the onset of the crisis, because we put more of our resources into trying to support staff with a transition to working from home and the mental health impacts that can have. But it's absolutely something that we've come back to later in the year. So we have analysed the data, we have discussed it with our staff, and we will be publishing that data exactly as we would normally. And we'd be encouraging all companies not to have a year off in their data, but to go back, analyse that data and make sure you've got a complete data set still. Even if there is a factor that says that your data gets worse for a year because of the compositional impact of COVID, have the confidence to have that conversation and explain the data rather than to try and hide from it, I think is definitely our strong message. We've also done something, again, as an employer, but we see it in some of our members as well. We launched a domestic violence policy this summer. And it's something we've had on the back of our minds as an employer for a while, and a number of our members have spoken to us about it. We're part of the Employers Initiative on domestic abuse. And there are more employers looking at this, and with the research out there showing it's an issue that's become more prevalent. One of the sad consequences of lockdown is it's become a more severe issue. It was important before, even more important now. There's more employers looking in that space through this crisis too. The no turning back research with Ipsos Mori was actually even more positive. It was data collected slightly later than the fieldwork period for the employment trends survey, and that says 2/3 of employers saying that they've increased their focus on inclusion. So overall, some reasons to be optimistic there.
Thank you, Nicky. One first follow-up question on that is what you're describing, does that reflect a sort of shift in mindset among employers, do you think, from, dare I say, from once upon a time seeing, addressing some of the issues we're talking about as being a cost, as being a sort of an additional cost item, which in a previous crisis, you would attempt to drop, because obviously when revenues go down, you cut costs. Whereas now the mindset is to think that inclusion, diversity, is actually not a cost. It's either a necessity or even an asset to build. Is that the fundamental shift, the difference between now and the aftermath of the financial crisis, you think?
Now and a decade ago, perhaps, yes. I don't think there's been a dramatic shift this summer, but I think there's been a gradual shift in that direction, yes. And I think you do see it more and more, the extent to which inclusion is a key aspect of being an employer of choice, and being an employer of choice is a key aspect of being able to attract the people that you need and top talent into your workforce. So even if you measured it, oh gosh, if we managed to get hold of the agendas of the CBI's annual conferences over the last 20 years, I've been there for 10 of them, but the 10 that predate me too, you know, I've really welcomed the extent to which questions of diversity and inclusion have become central to that conference, and people issues have become central to that conference. We had 1 or 2 sessions this year that were specifically about that, one about how you build back better and what fairness means in the future, and one specifically about people and inclusion. But yet it was coming up when we had BP there talking about organisational transformation, and they were actually talking about the role of mental health through this crisis in their organisation. Doing when I think CBI is at its best is when we're shamelessly stealing the ideas of our members and promoting them to other members. And one of the things that we heard from them at this conference was, you know, COVID didn't create these issues, COVID only amplified them. And so if you think that getting back to normal means everything's sorted, and they were speaking specifically about mental health here, then you're completely missing the point. Actually, it is something we need to, and you'd see the same in the way it plays out in some of these gender differences. COVID hasn't created these differences. You know, Barbara was saying her research shows that a lot of it is to do with the sorts of jobs that people are in. Well, actually, what extent is it possible to use things from this crisis to be able to learn lessons and make changes that mean that next time we're not putting as big a caveat on things to say this is because men and women are doing largely different jobs in the economy, but we can try and break down some of those differences.
Thank you. Last question, I suppose, is really the question that Barbara posed at the end of her presentation. How much of this is going to stick, do you think, in terms of the habits, the cultural change that we've seen driven by the last few months? And in terms of, I mean, thinking about that sort of business attitude, I think I'm right in saying you talked about about the importance of gender pay reporting. I think I'm right in saying that when gender pay reporting was first proposed, the CBI membership was actually quite strongly opposed to it. And yet that is something what there's been a change of attitude. So how much of what we've changed this year do you think will become a permanent feature of business life in the next decade?
Yeah, it's an interesting research topic for me, and my main piece of work I've got my team working on at the moment is exactly about remote working, which is the big shift that we've seen. For a long time, it's been discussed from all different aspects of sort of the policy interest community that the availability of flexible working was one of the key factors driving women towards certain jobs rather than other jobs, where they had other responsibilities, be that childcare, elder care, and a whole range of factors. And that, you know, it wasn't that everybody thought, well, what we want to do is go and work in certain sectors. It was that the work that fitted these other external factors was where it was most available. The whole concept of trading down your career to access flexibility at times. And I think that is something where hopefully there's some positives to come out of this crisis. I think we would have preferred that if it didn't take a crisis to deliver the change. But, you know, when we've been asking our members, what out of everything that's happened through COVID is something that's going to stick, one thing comes out above absolutely everything else, which is remote working. And I think the best articulation of this does come from the no turning back research that we did with Ipsos Mori and published earlier this week. 79% of firms said this summer that when they looked back at 2019, a typical week for their staff was mostly or entirely in the office. Their expectations for 2021 and beyond is that drops to 28%, where 28% of their staff are working entirely or mostly from an office, and 47% are doing some sort of hybrid between being in the office part-time and working remotely more often. And I think that is a really sizable shift. What our members are having to think through, and where, you know, we've got some in the vanguard, those companies that have been doing this for a long time already, and are the long tail of people who haven't, who are then having to try and learn from those who have got the most to teach about it, about how to do this quickly, because you're having to reimagine, what is your office for? Why do you have an office, and what is it for? What do you really need it for? Because it's certainly true. The idea that there's no need for any offices anymore is something people react as strongly to as the idea that there's no value in flexible working. It's clearly a hybrid, and that's why it comes out across the two. But what that research of what employers are expecting it's all about is saying is it's absolutely about team building still. It's absolutely about collaboration still. It is not going to be, I think it was like less than 5% of people saying that it was going to be about working at your desk in an individual way. That was kind of the bit that was going to change most. But there was even most people saying, we think meeting clients in the office is going to be a less common feature in the future. So even that interactions with clients is going to become more virtual and more able to do it from home without it being seen as like the second option, which I think has been one of those barriers to broader change over the last 5 years. So I think there is an awful lot going on there, and one of the things we've got the ambition to do is to be at the moment researching with our members what are the questions a business needs to ask itself to understand how it capitalizes and does hybrid working well. And I think that is about how do you set the right framework around flexibility, because it's not going to be saying you do what you like or us dictating every line to you about what you do. It is about finding the right framework that allows you to use the positives of time spent in an office along with the flexibility to do greater flexible working and remote working in a way that hopefully also helps to mean that the lack of availability of flexible working becomes much less frequently the barrier to someone's career progression and therefore a driver of the gender pay gap.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. Now our next panelist, Nicky Morgan. I see Matthew just talked about the policy community. So I suppose Nicky is here as a representative of the policy community, a small and persecuted minority pushed to the edges of society. So, but they're people too. So let's be nice to them. Nicky, you are, as I said earlier on, you have done lots of jobs, including you were Secretary of State for no, what is the title? Women and Equalities. I
was Minister for Women and Equalities. It's not a Secretary of State role, but it's yep, absolutely.
Yes. So, and I suppose in terms of the question that Matthew is set up nicely there, it's a question for businesses about how business makes the best of and keeps the best of what's changed in the last 6 months. How does policy, how does government and regulation, what should policymakers be doing to make sure that we cushion the impacts, some of those differential impacts that Barbara identified, but also to try and keep and reinforce some of the positives that have come out of this crisis?
So I think that is a fascinating question, and I suppose sort of 3 main answers. So first of all, you talk about the policy community, and I think don't forget the policy community is pretty broad. So you've obviously got ministers, and many of whom are absolutely front and centre dealing with the crisis, almost zero bandwidth to be able to really reflect on what's going on. Then, of course, you've got officials, and I think there's got to be a whole question asked about the way the Whitehall machinery, if I can like that, has responded to this crisis. But don't forget, of course, that the Whitehall machinery itself is an employer. So they themselves have got the experiences of getting thousands of people to work from home, exactly as Matthew's the CBI members will have done as well in terms of logistical and practical challenges. But then, you've also got departments like Treasury, who have, paying for a number of things, obviously nothing like furlough, but equally will be asked to, I suspect, invest more in, well, we will have learned things about childcare, invest more in childcare. And one of the asks is that childcare, I think, should already, but particularly as part of this, be seen as a sort of essential infrastructure when we're talking about infrastructure investment in this country, in the same way that we now think that broadband is part of infrastructure. And in a way, funny enough, I mean, is this one of the conclusions? I mean, Matthew rightly mentioned the what's going to happen to offices, but equally what's going to happen to transport infrastructure if people are not going to be I used to spend my life on East Midlands trains several times a week, up and down. I'm sitting here in Leicestershire. Actually, I like being on the train because it was a time when I was uninterrupted and could get stuff done. Now, in many ways, losing commuting time is for many people great, but equally, you know, it presents other challenges as well. So I think there's sort of departmental responses on the issues that our speakers have come up with as well. And I suppose the last thing I say on this, James, is, you know, we are not through the crisis yet. People had perhaps thought a couple of months ago we would be, but we're not yet. So we've still got further lessons, further experiences to learn. I thought the statement Barbara said about forced changes in work and society, and I think she mentioned obviously World War II, but I think very much a pandemic as well. Final thing, there will be others. So I'm on a House of Lords Life Beyond COVID committee. So even if bandwidth is constrained in ministers and Whitehall, there will be others, including think tanks like the SMF, who will hopefully have the bandwidth to do a lot of thinking that can then get fed into the policymakers as they come up with a response to what we've seen.
Thank you. And on that topic, I mean, you talk about the machinery of government, I suppose. Do you think that, even accepting all the challenges of essentially immediate crisis response,
yeah,
if you're a minister, if you're a senior official at the moment, you've basically just been trying to get through the last 6 months. Do you think that there is enough consciousness, awareness of issues like gender imbalance when policy is being made and implemented here? Is this, I mean, are these some of the issues that Barbara's research highlights? Are they, are they always at the top tier of considerations for policy, or are they sometimes treated as a bit of a second order consequence and afterthought?
Second order consequence, but I mean, one of the dangers for anybody in any position of either making policy or making decisions is you end up, you have to guard against, this is the whole thing about unconscious bias, you have to guard against making decisions only on the basis of your own experiences. So it may well be you've got senior policymakers who have got working partners, and they can see what's happening in terms of, childcare and the demands on it in their own homes. But there will, of course, be people for whom that is not a part of their experience at all. Or if it is, they've had, a third party living with them who's been able to help with childcare all the way through the crisis because of the way their household was set up, which is a completely different experience from somebody who lost every element of childcare at the start of the crisis, and then also tried to shift to working from home and being able to do it and everything else. So, I mean, I found a lot of the time my role as Minister for Women and Equalities was just basically to stick my hand up and say, where is the female, where is the equality angle, in this. I mean, I deliberately used to, every time that when I was doing it, George Osborne was Chancellor, when every cabinet meeting, when he briefed the cabinet about the budget, I made an absolute principle of putting my hand up and making sure that at least one woman in the room said something about the budget. And I think that it won't be because officials don't want to think about these things, but they need, whether again it's external pressure, it's through research, through think tanks, it's through select committees, it's through, particularly now the individuals on Twitter and everything else, they will need to be prodded constantly to think about these. I think what Matthew said is really fascinating, because I think for a lot of senior employers, both male and female actually, they have had to think about the working from home environment, if I can put it like that, in a way they've never thought of before. Because if you only ever see your employee turn up at 9 AM in the morning and go home at 5 PM or 10 PM or whatever it might be, their home situation's not relevant. You work on the basis that, we pay a salary, you're going to turn up, you're going to do this role or whatever, and you'll make yourself available for work. Unless, of course, there is perhaps some sort of family crisis. Now, exactly as Matthew said, when you're you're living online, you're having team meetings and all the rest of it, and you're seeing people's families, and I think it is completely fascinating the way that men and women deal with that situation. It's gone from, do you have a picture of your family on your desk? Men do, many women don't. To actually, it's very sweet if a child bursts into a man's room when they are giving an interview. It appears to be less accommodated when it's happening to women. And I find just even in that, and I think women feel it. Women are asking to go on furlough because they're saying, I can't do this any longer please put me on furlough. And I have that from a few senior women who've had to talk other women in their organisation saying, you can do this, and this is what we're going to put in place to make sure you feel you can carry on with your job.
Well, I think you're very nicely setting up what was my last question, and hopefully the Q&A, which is about the sort of the cultural attitudes around these issues, I suppose, and whether or not they are being fully challenged. And I to declare an interest, I suppose, as you know, other people might know, part of the reason why I do my current job and not my old job in a newspaper is because I have small children and I work almost part-time, so I can spend some time looking after them. And I think there is a big issue with the way policy is made and directed on some of these issues, with the fact that essentially a lot of men don't talk about and don't give enough value to issues of work-life balance and flexibility. And I'm just curious to know whether you think, and I think you're curious to know what Barbara and Matthew think about as well. You mentioned childcare. I mean, we all know at a policy level how important good childcare provision is across almost every aspect of employment and the economy, and yet for some reason it's never made a priority. Now, my hunch on that is bluntly that it's not made a policy, it's not made a priority because a lot of the people making the decisions about political priorities are men who don't regard it as being of immediate interest. And I'm just wondering whether or not you think there is you think, and whether other panelists think, that a crisis that has bluntly made more men spend more time looking after their children and realize quite how disruptive and burdensome, I say this in a nice way, my kids are at school, I can say what I like about them today, you realize that childcare is more burdensome and disruptive of work, whether or not that might just bring about a shift in the collective political attitude towards the importance and priority given to things like childcare. Can we finally see the issue moving up the agenda a bit, do you think?
I mean, I think, don't forget, in the coalition government, it very much did. I mean, you had, I'm not entirely sure about Danny Alexander's personal situation, but I think he had small children. You know, you have 4 men in the Quad, who all of whom had, relatively smallish children, and I think certainly 3 out of 4 of them working wives. And I don't know about Dan Alexander's situation.
His children went to the same school as mine, okay. In fact.
But, no, they are. So I remember, as Treasury Minister, Minister of Inequalities, I mean, it was extraordinary listening to childcare being raised right there across the chamber and being used as an election issue. So I'm not sure I'd agree it's not been, but it has fallen back in terms of importance, definitely. Undoubtedly, people's experiences again during lockdown will shape and are shaping how they respond to these things. I thought the other thing that was fascinating about Barbara's presentation, some of the work, was, we're talking about government and policymaker response and all the rest of it. There is also a response to be had, and it's sort of, I'm not sure we'll put it as an analysis, we'll put more as family meetings around the kitchen table, but families themselves, or units, if I can put it like that, are going to have to work out what lesson they draw from this current situation. Is it going to be, and often it takes a sort of a big situation like this for it could be the father to say, actually I want to be at home more, or to say actually this has not worked at all, or if we're going to do this working from home thing, we've got to completely change literally physically where we work in the house. Many houses, and the way we again occupy homes, is if we're going to do more work from home, that's going to change. Are we set up to do it, got the infrastructure and everything else? So I think it will prompt very different discussions, and I entirely agree with Matthew. I was a bit unsure about this earlier on this year. Everyone said everything's changed, we're not going to go back to how we are. I think we all want to go back to some sort of normality, but normality, I think Matthew's absolutely right, which is to say we're not going to go back to how things were in March, because some things have been amplified which we have to deal with.
Thank you. Barbara, what are your thoughts on that, that question about childcare provision particularly? Do you think that's one of the things where we could see a slightly renewed focus on policy?
I think I agree. We really should keep the focus on parental involvement in childcare in the medium run, and by medium run I mean when things go more or less back to normal in terms of restrictions, to really see whether there has been some useful learning in the experience, for example, of more fathers becoming in charge of childcare. And this is probably the sort of silver lining or the optimistic views about the longer term consequences of the crisis. But we shouldn't forget a lot of the things that also Nicky was mentioning, for example, that when the childcare load increases, the larger share goes on mothers. And the gender pay gap these days is all about children. Let's say it's all about childcare. So if we go back to, say, the 1960s, the gender pay gap was humongous, and that was explained by the fact that women had less education, there was discrimination within the same job, and then there was the impact of children. Now, education gaps have reversed. Outright discrimination within the same job is basically almost not there anymore. It's all completely about children. So the fact that women were doing 13 more hours of childcare during the crisis might mean, for example, as Nicky was hinting at before, that they might be more likely to just ask to be furloughed and basically don't keep you on the sort of double burden. And these things may have permanent consequences. Another interesting thing about parents being inside the household, both of them doing childcare and homeschooling, is that they tend to have on average different patterns of homeschooling. So for example, when fathers do homeschooling and when they work on their own job from home, they do one or the other. Mothers are much more likely to juggle both at the same time and to be interrupted many times in whatever they're doing. And this, of course, has an impact in the way you're perceived on the other side of the screen, the way you're productive and concentrated in what you're doing. And then all the research we have shows that whatever involvement you have with your children has consequences on your labor market involvement through many channels. I mean, but this is very clear research about it.
Thank you. Matthew, any thoughts on whether or not, from an employer perspective, to drill down a little bit into what particularly employers will be thinking about doing to support and reinforce some of those changes around childcare and from both male and female perspectives?
Well, I think CBI has been a step ahead of government for the last 5 years on calls for childcare. And one of the things that I led in a piece of work back in 2014 was identifying the fact that there was a gap in support between the end of paid maternity leave and parental leave and the beginning of childcare support. And for us, the greater priority was bridging that gap so that there wasn't this real crunch period, which was when our members said that was when their workers were leaving the workforce and deciding things were too difficult. That was the number one childcare priority, rather than more hours for people who already had hours, if we had to choose between both. Obviously, we think more of both would be a good thing. And you've seen this summer from us, when we've been talking about the enablers of an economic restart, being able to keep schools open and invest in childcare have been two of those enablers for exactly that reason, because such a large part of our workforce, and increasingly mothers and fathers, have found that it has been a prohibitive factor to them being able to play their full part in the workplace as they would normally do when schools are closed and they're having to try and be a teacher as well as trying to fit in their work. Almost if you try and start your work when the kids go to bed, it's really not going to be a productive way of trying to juggle things. And so I think there is a big shift and a change there. If we think about some of the ways employers are responding to some of the changes we saw Barbara's presentation talking about, I guess one of the things that stood out to me there was also the proportion of people in which they said the responsibility was shared has gone down. So increasingly, it's been one parent or the other picks things up, whereas a lot of the policy agenda for a while has been pushing towards how do we get more people into the shared bucket. So when things unwind and maybe things become shared again, does that then see the father percentage drop right down or not? I don't know. One of the factors that I know our members have been telling us they've been responding to is a growing expectation from their staff that they have a good parental offer that is equally applicable to fathers as to mothers. And that's a shift, that's a market response, because when workers are looking for that, then employers have to respond, not because there was legislation or anything else, but because if you don't, you're going to miss out on talent. And if the workers are telling you that they want it, you have to respond. And let's remember that one of the reasons that we have the sorts of maternity packages that employers have that go well beyond statutory minimums are because for decades, employers were being told, well, this is the way to be able to attract women into your workforce. And now it's becoming the way to attract young men into your workforce too. And so I think we are seeing more and more of this gradual shift. towards greater parental offers rather than maternity offers, and whether that's articulated as paternity leave or parental leave, I think is each company making their own decision.
And perhaps just as a sort of cultural, business cultural accommodation of the balance between work and family responsibilities. So which is one of the hard things to quantify, but it's just in terms of outlook of the organisation. Thank you very much, mate. We should go to questions, since we've got questions coming in on the chat panel, and hopefully we can make the technology work. So the first person I'd like to spotlight for a question is Isabel. So out of SMF, can we bring Isabel? We have an Isabel. Can we get Isabel on screen to ask a question about? It's a great question. It's about marital satisfaction. But there's Isabel. We can no. If you can unmute yourself, it's entirely up to you if you want to be visible on camera as well. I don't know. But if you'd can we unmute Isabel so she can ask a question?
Oh, sorry. Hi.
Oh, hello. We can hear you, Isabel. So hey, I feel like a regional DJ doing this job. We've got Isabel on the line now from Greater Cleethorpes. Isabel, you've got a funny story. Sorry. Anyway, Isabel, what would you like to ask your question, Isabel?
I was just having a think about the results, and I know that the data has only been from May, from this year. I was just wondering, from the long term, will there be like knock-on effects for marital satisfaction, given the fact that we see these dramatic shifts in household provisions? Or is it going to make stronger bonds, or is it too soon to say?
Excellent question. Probably requires a degree of speculation, possibly even revealing speculation from panelists. I don't know. But should we start with Barbara? What do you think? Do you think marriages will be made stronger or not by the experiences and changes you've charted in your data?
I think it's a very interesting question, and I think we might know more about the UK, for example, from Understanding Society data, who do have data, for example, on lifetime satisfaction. I don't know whether just that's specific to marriage or not. I don't know the data well enough. But actually, there have been other studies pre-pandemic about impacts of gender role on marital satisfaction. So basically, there is a study from the US that finds that families in which there is some reversal of traditional gender roles because the woman is potentially the breadwinner or the higher wage earner, those cases have a negative impact on satisfaction with marriage and a positive impact with the incidence of divorce. So we do see in other contexts that the reversal of gender roles may break some norm that may show up in a sort of quality of the marriage. Now, the pandemic is kind of different because we have seen a reversal of gender roles, but on the other hand, this has been forced. I mean, it wasn't really the choice of the mother to do less childcare or the choice of the father to do. I mean, there is, of course, an element of choice, but there is also an element of basically restriction. So the interesting question is whether this will have an impact on satisfaction with marriage. I think it's a very important thing to look at.
Just briefly, sorry, you mentioned on a sort of methodological point. You mentioned Understanding Society there. Possible not everybody here knows what Understanding Society is. Can you just give us a quick overview of what you mean by Understanding Society?
Yeah, it's a survey of UK households that has a longitudinal component. So households are interviewed every year for a certain number of years, and they're interviewed about several aspects of their family life, their work life, and also their beliefs, their attitudes, their satisfaction. During COVID, this has been carried out every month. So there's a lot more frequent information, but also there is less information. So I can't tell at the moment whether there's information on marriage satisfaction, but there might be after the crisis, actually.
It's basically a really useful sort of trove of data for researchers on who want to understand society, as an instance. Now, Nicky and Matthew, speculating on marital satisfaction is possibly beyond both of your respective professional remits, so it's entirely up to you if you want to come in on the subject or not. Nicky's unmuted herself, which indicates enthusiasm, which is
dangerous. Yeah, very dangerous. I wasn't going to share my own lockdown experiences. All I was going to say was, I looked it up. There's a BBC article from the 12th of September which was reporting on Citizen Advice Bureau evidence saying that divorce guidance searches has risen since April after a drop in visits when lockdown started. It said views on its divorce web pages on the 1st September weekend were up 25% compared with the same date in 2019. Now, obviously, searching for divorce is not the same as actually doing it, but there is anecdotal evidence to say that family lawyers are busy in ways that they have not been before. So, as ever with these things, I suspect family relationships were under strain. You know, this year has really put them under strain even further. And of course, what this doesn't show is the average age of the people and whether they have children, how old those children are, and everything else. And as Faye Weldon has shown us recently, you can still get to your 80s and decide actually you'd like to get divorced at that stage, which I thought was pretty impressive, actually.
I think it's true. It's still true that divorce rates are rising fastest among people over 60. In fact, anyway, by the by, Matthew, you're still muted. I'm guessing you're passing on the questions. It may be beyond the CPI remit.
I have absolutely no insights from our members as to what their expectations are for all their employees' future marriages.
No worries at all. Now the next question, I'd like to go to Kirsty Bowman. Sorry, it appears to be double barrel now. I can only see the first half. Kirsty Bowman V. It says on my screen. Kirsty Bowman V. If you'd like to join us. No.
Thank
Kirsty,
you.
What's your question?
Hi. So I'm speaking from the Money and Pension Service, and we're doing a lot of work looking at gender inequality and women and financial well-being. So we'd heard from the panelists that what we've seen is a reduction in the sex-based childcare gap. We've heard that there could be some positive outcomes for women where it comes to their career, as we may see a reduction of compromises being made in order to achieve flexibility. However, it's unlikely to be in that way for all. And so I'm curious what we know at this point about any differential impact from a socioeconomic perspective or an ethnicity perspective.
Thank you. Barbara, that's really primarily a question for you, I think.
Sure. I'm afraid I haven't myself looked into like socioeconomic gaps or ethnic gaps, but I mean, in the context of gender, this is a very important question. So it's basically about what should we expect as the long-term impacts, for example, of what's happening now on the motherhood penalty and the fatherhood penalty. So we know that there might be a penalty in terms of labor market earnings for becoming a parent, but the difference between men and women couldn't be sharper. So if one looks at the sort of longitudinal series of earnings for fathers-to-be and mothers-to-be, before they become parents, those two tracks are completely on top of each other. As soon as the first child arrives, there is an event, which is basically a non-event for fathers. The earnings track continues on exactly the same path. And for mother, there is a big reduction in earnings that persists for like 10 or 20 years, depending on how good data we have to look into that. So whatever makes the childcare gap smaller, or whatever makes the childcare involvement more gender neutral, is definitely something that is going to help closing the gap. Now, in the evidence that we have seen from the pandemic, we know that there are distributional consequences. So in some families, the father had to get in charge of childcare. Will that have an impact on the medium run? We'll wait and see, possibly. Let's not forget that this is 18% of households. On average, if we take the average household, women's involvement in childcare has increased, and the gap has actually increased from 9 hours a week to 13 hours a week. So if that implies any sort of long-term consequence, there is, I mean, we should be pessimistic about what women are doing in terms of the labor market investment when they're spending like 50% more time in childcare. So what I'm saying, I mean, this second lockdown is going to be interesting from this point of view, because there's not going to be the childcare component. There's going to be the labor market component. So do we observe choices made during the first lockdown to persist in some way or another during the second lockdown? So we will see.
Thank you. Nicky, can I sort of direct that question a little at you from a sort of, again, from a government and policy perspective? when thinking about these things, and I'm very conscious, been thinking about this all the way through the presentation, that we are talking about aggregates, the population level aggregate experience here. And we know from other evidence that your experience of lockdown varies a lot by income. And obviously there are limitations on what we know from data at the moment, but how conscious do you think policy needs to be of the fact that or essentially, well, what you could describe as the intersectionality here, how socioeconomic status interacts with some of those sex-based gaps that Kirsty was talking about. That bluntly, that if you are a woman in a middle-class professional office-based job where your work can be done looking at a screen, that's a very different economic experience to working in a customer-facing service industry where furlough and unemployment are much more much more live issues. And how can that be incorporated into policy thinking, I suppose?
Well, again, goes back to ways of what we just forward. First of all, is asking the question, and that relies both on, I suspect there are people in the Government Equalities Office who will be aware of intersectionality as a, it's more than a concept, as something that needs to be taken into account in terms of policy making, but before now. But then obviously, again, research, evidence, select committees, experiences from members of Parliament and others is vital in terms of feeding that in and what's actually happening. But it's very difficult for government to come up with effective policy that then doesn't get criticised for being perhaps overcomplicated. But the more variables you have, so I think income is often a very easy one. If your income's below this, you'll get this support. If it's above this, you won't get, and that's what we see often in terms of childcare. So income or by proxy hours worked than anything else. But you're absolutely right. And this is the difficulty, I think, with policy making generally, is that you're trying, particularly I think at the moment, you're trying to, you've got a national or as we've just seen, a sort of England-wide policy, but everybody's lives are very different. And so actually making it work, and I think this is what, so talking to my former parliamentary colleagues, these are the hardest queries they're getting, which is, we understand the furlough scheme's been designed for X, but actually my life is Y. And it doesn't work for me, and how do you adjust that and everything else? And that's, that is a real challenge. So, but the more research we can have, so I think the question that Kirsty's asked is actually great. So the more people are listening, the more research we can have with these sorts of things, it gets fed into government policy making machine eventually, the more likely policy is to be a little more nuanced.
I think, since I'm sure our kindly sponsors from UK Research and Innovation will take that message on board, I hope. Matthew, from an employer perspective, I mean, how does this differ for different sectors and different employers? Because in some ways we've talked a little about the corporate environment, but as we get to the bottom end of the income, the income distribution. Are there different considerations there around how employers can support all workers and encourage, particularly female staff, and support them? Is that in a different way to those figurative office-based workers I was talking about?
Yeah, and I think even within industries where the sorts of flexibility that we've spoken about, being able to work from home, are more common, employers have been very conscious. Some of the reasons that they've reopened offices are where they know they've got members of staff who do not have a good home working environment. There is a world of difference between the person who has repurposed their spare room or their study to the person who is living in a flat share and it's a couple renting a room and they're trying to work on a laptop, trying to do their own conference calls perched on either side of a bed. That's a completely different experience, and even that is not at the very bottom of the socio-economic spectrum here. I think employers have been conscious of trying to say this summer more than ever, maybe, the dangers of generalizing in data. And I think one of the things that they're trying to get right is that balance between using data at an aggregated level to help identify problems and identify what you can do to address them, but knowing that within that data there is a huge diversity of experience. And it's the same for gender as it is for, say, the rejection of the label BAME by a number of people of different ethnicities. Like, well, I'm not BAME, I have different experiences. But from an employer's perspective, you probably need to start collecting data at the BAME level so that you can analyze it, but you can't stop there. You need to go beyond that. And I think the same is true of gender. And that's where I think one of the most common responses that we see from our members is the extent to which they've developed employee networks to actually have conversations and understand the individual experience of different bits of their workforce, rather than just to take like an annual employee opinion survey and have asked who the women were, asked them an opinion, and therefore taken a homogenous view of what their worker experience is. In terms of trying to think about this intersectionality angle, I think we have also got a lot of employers, again, one step ahead of where government is on this. So CBI and lots of our members have been saying, actually, it is time to introduce mandatory ethnicity pay reporting. Government's done some consultations on it. We haven't seen that a plan for how it would be introduced yet. But we're on the record saying that we're supportive of the idea. I sit with another hat where I'm part of the steering committee that informs the Parker Review on ethnicity representation on boards, and another business-led initiative that the CBI has been at the very heart of for this year is launching the Change the Race Ratio initiative, which is trying to be to the questions of ethnicity what the 30% Club was to questions of gender, and getting a founding group of businesses who say, we believe in this has to be a moment of change, not a moment of press releases and tweets of support, but not really changing anything on the ground. What do we do to implement that? And since we've launched it, we've had more and more businesses coming forward. Some actually, it's in a nice regard, angry with us for having not approached them to sign up before we did the first press release, which is always a better response than angry with us for having launched it. But we're getting more and more people signed up to that initiative over time. And that whole thing is based on transparency. So if you're thinking out there, well, how does the research community deal with this? If you're signing up to that initiative, what you're saying is you will publish your ethnicity pay gap. You will publish your ethnicity representation in your boardroom and in your executive pipeline. And the way that this agenda moves it forward is not to tell you exactly what to do, but to say measure it, make that transparent, and set yourself targets for what you think improvement means in your workplace, and how and set targets that you would be comfortable defending in public. And I think the same applies to gender as it does to ethnicity. Is there scope to make action plans mandatory in gender pay gap reporting? I think so, at the same time as making action plans mandatory in mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting. They're all steps that we can take, and I don't think you'll have widespread business resistance to that, because when we speak to our members, they're things that they are supporting. So hopefully that also starts to get some of the intersectionality, because we don't only measure one thing. We start to measure multiple different things, and then have to think, when we consider those different data sets together, what does that mean, rather than considering them in isolation?
Thank you, man. Yeah, definite vote from me for more data. We like data. I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question from Emily Nisbet of UKRI, in fact. So if we got, Emily's now on screen and unmuted. So Emily, career progression. What's your question, Emily?
Oh, hi. Yeah, I was just wondering how you believe that gender issues seen during lockdown might impact on career progression in the longer term. You're talking about, increased childcare responsibilities, or women opting to take furlough, for example. So yeah, that was my question.
Great, thank you very much. Now I'm going to try and scrupulously keep the time, so we're going to try. Everyone gets about a minute to answer the question at most. So, Barbara, what you can go first on long-term impacts on career progression.
Yeah, this is going to be important for career progression if, say, young women and young men make different decisions on their long-term labor market involvement depending on what is their sort of childcare load right now. So this is, of course, going to be important in the medium run. Now, when we're talking about career progression, maybe there is a category that comes to my mind even before the sort of men and women is really young people leaving education now. I mean, this is going to be disastrous for their career entry and progression. So probably if we really think about what is the impact on career progression of what's happening now, then I would really keep the focus on young people.
Thank you. That was brilliantly brief. Less than a minute, in fact. Nicky, would like to go next. You can have 65 seconds, in fact.
Thank you, Barbara. I agree with that. Sadly, I think the impact on young men and women is going to be dramatic of what we have seen, and will require obviously a big policy response from government and from employers and others. I think so. Therefore, much depends on the age of the women. But I mean, one of the things we talked about today, for example, is working from home, and there may well be women for whom actually, in some ways, you now don't have to prove the case that you can be productive when you're working from home. But of course, in terms of, as Barbara said, the choices that women make in terms of their return to the workforce, my worry is that men and women will make different choices, and therefore it'll be incumbent on employers, public, private sector, particularly to guard against things like presenteeism. And so, you know, if the person's not in the room, even if they're on Microsoft Teams, that somehow their career progression is affected because they haven't come back to the office. That was obviously always a concern and a danger, but I think perhaps heightened by the fact that many people will say, actually, I can do this from home, not realising the longer term consequences for their career.
Thank you. Now, Matthew, if you can be equally brief, because actually I'm going to, having said that was the last question, I'm going to try and squeeze one more person in incredibly quickly after this. So if you can go next, then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think that there are definitely long-term changes coming from this. I think how well we normalise flexible and remote working is going to be the biggest factor in that. And probably that's a bigger change for me than the distribution of childcare responsibility, because as I was saying, our members were experiencing more and more of their male staff coming forward and saying, we're interested in what your offer to fathers is here. So it goes back to what I was saying at the very start. COVID didn't really create any of these things. It just amplified them and accelerated some things. And if it leads to an acceleration in the extent to which fathers are taking on more of the childcare responsibility, then that's just an acceleration of a trend we're already seeing, and employers are, as ever, challenged to respond to what their employees are expecting of them, and to see what they are able to do in that environment. And we've seen lots of employers come forward. We had some again at our conference this week saying we saw this as the exact moment in which we needed to up our offer for fathers in the workplace in order to make it more equal to our offer to mothers. Not all employers can afford to go to exactly the same terms overnight, but committing to going on that journey is the first step.
Thank you. Now, in the last 90 seconds or so, possibly, I'm going to try and bring in Sue Lewis, who had asked in a different panel if she could actually make a point. Well, make a point, not ask a question, because we haven't got time for panel responses. But Sue wants to talk about the really important issue of economic abuse, and so I'd like to give her a chance to talk about that before we wrap up. So, Sue, if you can make your point in a crisp, short, sharp contribution.
Yeah, I'm no good at 90 seconds. Okay, so I'm a trustee of surviving economic abuse. We've done some research, and what, excuse me, what we've found is that many women are being deprived of resources like laptops, or their partners won't do childcare, so they haven't been able to work during the lockdown. Some need a safe space to go to, but in the longer term, I think this sort of remote working will become an issue where women who suffer this kind of abuse need help. And I think the CBI, actually, I'd quite like to follow up with you, Matthew, if possible.
Good. Well, in that case, well, yes. Well, I think
Sure.
possibly we can.
Thank you, James.
Well, hopefully we
I
brought you
have a lot
together
more to say.
electronically. You can continue that conversation. But certainly, Matthew, I have to say, I was unaware that the CBI had adopted a domestic abuse policy, which sounds like a very good thing. And so, yeah, more publicising of that sounds like a positive. So, anyway, thank you, Sue. Now, I'm aware. So, I'm painfully conscious. I've broken my golden rule. I've got a minute over time. So, I really should wrap up at this point. So, I need to thank lots of people and thank you all for coming. I need to thank UKRI and the ESRC for making this event and all of these events possible. I need to say thank you to Nicky and especially Nicky being my boss, and Matthew and especially Barbara for sharing the research, and also to say, well, thank you for coming. To be aware, we have another of these Ask the Expert events, which will be on the 24th of November. The topic then is the green recovery and what policy can do to both dig us out of the crisis and also decarbonize at the same time. So equally complicated and important. So I do hope to see you again. I think also one last question. We had a sorry, I should have mentioned this. We had somebody asking Barbara if we for a copy of your slides. So if you're happy to share those, anybody who came to the presentation, if you get in touch on the normal email, or we might even see if we can post copies of the slides online on our website. But one way or another, we will make the slides available to anybody who wants them. So with that, I'm now 2 minutes over time. Sorry, sacking offence. I will just say thank you all very much indeed for coming, and I do hope to see you again at the virtual and maybe even one day the real world SMF for another one of these events. So thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great discussion today. Bye.